Before this story begins, it deals with loss, grief, and a veteran in serious pain. If you or someone you love is struggling, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available right now. Call or text 988. Any hour, any day. Now let's talk about what happened next. Marcus Webb had been at the VA clinic on Marymount Avenue for his own appointment, which had run long the way those appointments sometimes did. Not because anything was wrong, but because the particular kind of talking the appointments required took longer to finish than the clock allowed for, and the therapist he saw had learned in 3 years of seeing him that cutting Marcus off mid-sentence cost more than it saved. He had come out into the parking lot at 4:15 with the specific, wrung-out emptiness of someone who has just said true things out loud and is now carrying the weight of having said them alongside the weight of the things themselves. Birch had been waiting in the truck. He came out of the back seat with the rolling, full-body enthusiasm of a yellow Labrador who has been patient for 90 minutes and has opinions about that, and Marcus had clipped his leash and let him run the strip of grass along the parking lot edge because Birch had earned it, and because watching Birch be purely, uncomplicatedly joyful about a strip of parking lot grass was one of the more reliable correctives Marcus had found for the particular wait of post-appointment afternoons. He heard the words because the parking lot was mostly empty, and the man said them at a volume that was not meant to carry, but did, the way things said to no one in particular sometimes do when the air is still and the afternoon is quiet. An old man in a brown coat, sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the lot, looking at nothing. Don't look for me after this. He said it the way a person says something they have been thinking for a long time and have finally said out loud, not as a statement to anyone present, not as a threat, just as a fact arriving in the air, a decision given voice. And the quality of it was the specific quality Marcus had been trained to hear and had heard before and could not unknow once he had heard it. Birch stopped running. He turned and looked at the man on the wall. Then he walked to him in the unhurried, purposeful way of a Labrador who has decided something is his business and does not require permission to make it so. He sat down on the man's feet. Just that. Just the warm weight of a 50-pound dog, settling onto the feet of a man who had just said goodbye to the air. What happened in the hours that followed? The long night, the porch, the kitchen table, the letter that a woman had written to her husband 2 years before she died, because she had known him well enough to know he would need it. None of it was a rescue in the way that word is usually meant. There was no villain to defeat, no deadline to beat, no document that needed finding. There was only a man who was carrying more than a person can carry alone, and someone who sat down beside him and did not leave. If this kind of story is the kind that stays with you, subscribe before we continue. This channel does not look away from the hard ones. You'll want to be here. Marcus had grown up in Winston-Salem and come to Asheville 2 years ago, the way people come to places that are not where they started, following something that felt like the right direction without being able to name what the direction was toward. He had served 8 years, 2 deployments, and had come home with a particular interior reorganization that combat produces, not broken, recalibrated, and working every day on understanding the difference. He was 33 years old and went to the VA appointments because the therapist was good and because he had made a decision, somewhere in the middle of his second year home, that asking for help was not the opposite of strength. That decision had cost him something to make and had returned more than it cost, which was the kind of math he tried to remember on the days when it was hard to believe. Birch had been with him for 14 months. He was a yellow Labrador of the specific variety that seemed to radiate warmth the way a wood stove does, not performing warmth, simply being it, making the air around him a degree or two more bearable than the air elsewhere. He was not a dramatic dog. He did not have the sinewy alertness of the Malinois breeds, did not assess and position and calculate in the manner of a working dog built for tactical thinking. He was warm, and he was present, and he understood, with the deep, unhurried intelligence of his breed, that sometimes the most important thing a creature can do is sit down next to someone and stay there. He had sat on Marcus's feet on the hard nights more times than Marcus had counted. It was not a trained behavior. It was simply what Birch did when he understood that a person needed to be reminded they were in their body. Gene Tanner had been a history teacher for 31 years at Asheville High School, which meant he had spent 3 decades in a room full of young people who did not yet know how much they would need the things he was trying to give them. And he had given them anyway, with the patient commitment of a man who understood that teaching is mostly faith. He had been good at it. He had the particular gift of making the past feel present, of helping a 16-year-old understand that the people in the history book were just people, scared and ambitious and confused and capable of both tremendous things and terrible ones, which is the thing about human beings that never changes, and which is, in the end, the only lesson history actually teaches. He had served in Korea at 20, which he had not talked about in a classroom context, not because he was ashamed of it or because it was too painful, but because he had decided early in his teaching career that his own experience was not the point, and that making it the point would make the history about him rather than about the people it belonged to. He kept his discharge papers in a drawer and his unit photograph on the wall of his study, and he visited the memorial in Washington once, in 1995, and stood in front of it for a long time and did not explain to Ruth what he was thinking. And she did not ask, because she understood that some things do not need explaining to the right person. Ruth had been the right person for 44 years. She had been a librarian and a gardener and a maker of very good soup, and the kind of woman who remembered not just birthdays, but the things that happened around them, the context of a year, the mood of a season, what a person had needed, and whether they had gotten it. She had loved Gene with the practical, thoroughgoing love of someone who has assessed a person fully and decided they are worth the full investment, and she had understood him in the way you understand someone after 4 decades, not just their words, but the silences between them, not just what they said, but what they couldn't. She had been diagnosed 2 years before she died. She had handled the diagnosis with the specific, organized courage of a librarian, categorizing what was known, setting aside what wasn't, finding the resources, and making a list. The list included a letter. She had written it on a Tuesday afternoon at the kitchen table, in her handwriting that Marcus would later describe as the handwriting of a woman who had decided every word mattered, and she had sealed it and given it to Pastor Calvin Mosby at Riverside Baptist with instructions that were precise. He would know when to open it. She had not told Gene. She had known Gene. After she died, Gene had kept the house the way he kept everything, carefully, in order, each thing in its place. He had kept the soup recipe card on the refrigerator, even though he made the soup badly, twice, and ate it both times, because the attempt was a form of the thing itself. He had kept the garden through the first summer with more effort than he had known he had, because Ruth had loved the garden, and he did not know yet how to love the things she had loved without her there to love them with him. The second summer the garden had gone to seed. He had looked at it from the back porch and understood that he did not have the energy anymore to keep something alive that was supposed to be kept alive together, and that understanding had been the beginning of the disappearing. He had stopped going to the church by November. Not dramatically, just stopped. Calvin had called twice, and Gene had said he was fine, and Calvin had believed him, because Gene was very convincing when he said he was fine, which was the thing Ruth had told Calvin 2 years earlier when she gave him the letter. He will say he is fine, she had written. He will mean it when he says it. He will not be fine. She had known Jean. By the following spring, Jean had stopped answering most calls. He had stopped going to the coffee shop where he had gone every Saturday for 15 years. He had stopped, by small and incremental degrees, the maintenance of a life, the way a house goes unmaintained. Not all at once, but room by room. The smallest things first, until the accumulation of the small things becomes the condition of the whole. He had driven to the VA clinic that afternoon, not for himself, but to pick up a form for a neighbor who had no transportation, because Jean still did the things that were for other people. It was only the things for himself that had become difficult. He had sat on the concrete wall after he got back to the parking lot because his legs had been tired. And he had sat there long enough that the tiredness became the afternoon. And the thought that had been living in him for some time had come, as it sometimes did in the late afternoons, to the front. He had said it because it was there. He had not known anyone could hear him. Then, a yellow dog sat on his feet. "He yours?" Jean said. "He decided that," Marcus said. He sat down on the wall, not too close. Close enough. Birch did not look up at Jean. He sat on his feet and faced forward, and was warm and heavy and entirely still, the way a dog is still when it has done the thing it came to do and is waiting for the situation to catch up with the decision. Jean looked at the dog for a long moment. "I had a dog," he said, "years ago." "Beagle." Ruth picked him out. He paused. "She always said dogs know things." "They do," Marcus said. He did not say anything else yet. He had learned, in the years since he started doing this, the sitting with, the not looking away, that the most important thing in the first minutes was not to fill the space. The space was working. The space was where the person found the words, if words were coming. They sat. The afternoon light dropped toward the mountains. Birch was warm and still. "I'm not doing very well," Jean said finally. He said it with the direct simplicity of a man who has stopped having the energy for the performance of fine. "I know," Marcus said. "I heard you." Jean looked at him. He had the eyes of a man who has spent 30 years paying attention to young people and has developed, from that, an instinctive ability to read whether another person is being honest or careful. He read Marcus and found honest. He looked back at the mountains. "She died 8 months ago," he said. "My wife." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Everyone says that," Jean said, without bitterness. "I know they mean it. It doesn't do anything with the mornings." He paused. "The mornings are when I know she's gone. Every morning. As fresh as the first one." Birch pressed his weight more firmly against Jean's feet. "There is something that needs to be said here, directly, to anyone watching this who knows what Jean's mornings feel like. The weight of grief is real, and it is serious, and it does not mean you are broken, and it does not mean it will always be exactly this heavy. There are people who know how to sit with you in it. 988, your pastor. Your doctor. Someone. Please, tell someone." Jean told a stranger in a parking lot, and the stranger stayed. "You deserve someone who will stay." Marcus called Calvin Mosby from the truck, while Jean was inside the clinic getting the neighbor's form, which gave him 4 minutes. He knew Calvin, because Calvin ran the Veterans Outreach Ministry at Riverside Baptist and had crossed paths with Marcus twice through the VA's Community Partnership Program, and Marcus had found him to be the specific kind of pastor who understood that being useful was more important than being correct. He said Jean's name. He said what he had heard. He said where he was. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ruth gave me something for him. 2 years ago. I've been waiting to know when. He said he would come." Marcus drove Jean home because Jean's car was at the clinic, and Marcus said he would take him back for it later, and Jean, who was tired in a way that went past the usual tiredness, did not argue. Birch rode in the back with Jean, which he had never done with a stranger before, and he lay across Jean's lap for the 20-minute drive, and Jean held him the way you hold something that is keeping you attached to where you are. The house on Kimberly Avenue was a white house with a covered porch and a garden that had gone to seed, and the particular quality of a house that was maintained in the ways that maintenance is habitual, but had lost the warmth that makes a maintained house a home. Inside it was clean and orderly and entirely quiet in the way that houses are quiet when only one person has been living in them, and that person has stopped having reasons for the radio. On the kitchen counter, a coffee mug. One. On the refrigerator, the soup recipe card in Ruth's handwriting. Jean sat at the kitchen table. Birch put himself across Jean's feet and did not move. Jean looked at the dog for a moment, and then put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. The large and slightly ink-stained hands of a man who had spent 30 years writing on chalkboards. And he said, "She used to leave the light on. I keep turning it on myself now, but it's not the same. I'm the one who knows it's on." He said it to his hands, not to Marcus, to the kitchen and to the soup recipe card, and to the 44 years, and the morning that came every morning still, fresh every time. Marcus sat across the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He stayed, which was the thing. Birch's tail moved once, slowly, against the floor. Calvin Mosby arrived 20 minutes later with the letter. He was a large man with a quiet way of entering a room, not diminishing himself, but being careful with the space. The way people are careful with space when they understand it belongs to someone else. He had known Jean and Ruth for 11 years, had done Ruth's funeral, had called Jean twice in the months after, and received the fine that Jean gave everyone. He sat down at the kitchen table without ceremony, and he put the letter on the table between himself and Jean, and he said, "Ruth asked me to hold this until you needed it. I think you need it." Jean looked at the envelope. His name was on the front in Ruth's handwriting, which was the handwriting of a woman who had decided every word mattered, and the sight of it did something to his face that was not grief exactly. It was the expression of a person encountering something they had stopped believing was still in the world. He did not open it immediately. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. And Birch got up from the floor and put his head in Jean's lap and stayed there. And the kitchen was very quiet. Then Jean opened the letter. Marcus looked at the table while Jean read it. He did not read it over Jean's shoulder, and he did not watch Jean's face. He gave the man his privacy inside the room, which was the specific gift of being present without intruding, the gift of company without the performance of witnessing. Birch did not move. Jean read the letter twice. Then he folded it along Ruth's original fold lines and held it in both hands and was quiet for a long time. "She knew," he said finally. His voice was different, not lighter, something more foundational than lighter, more solid. The voice of a man who has just been reminded of something he had lost track of, something that had been true for 44 years and had not stopped being true. "What did she say?" Calvin asked gently. Jean looked at the letter in his hands. She said, "He stopped. He started again. She said she knew I would get to a place where I thought the story was over. She said she wanted me to know that she had never in 44 years thought the story was over." He paused. She said, "The light isn't on for me anymore. It's on for you. Turn it on. I already know." The kitchen was completely still. Calvin put his hand over Jean's on the table. Marcus looked at the soup recipe card on the refrigerator, and thought about the things people leave behind for the people they love. The letters written at kitchen tables 2 years before death. The careful and deliberate act of someone who knows they are going and wants to make sure a specific person is not left without what they need. He thought about the 44 years of a woman paying attention to a man, the soup recipe card, the library, the garden, the understanding that ran so deep it reached 2 years past her own death and landed exactly where it was supposed to land. He thought about Birch, who was still on Jean's feet, warm and patient, and entirely certain that this was where he was supposed to be. Jean did not get better all at once, because grief does not work that way, and the story does not pretend it does. He called his son that evening, not because Marcus asked him to, but because the letter had said, "Call Daniel. He is waiting for you to call. He does not know how to go first." The call lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes, and Daniel, who was in Charlotte, drove to Asheville the following Saturday and stayed for a week, and did not leave until he had made his father a standing appointment with a grief counselor at the VA and had his number in Jean's phone and Jean's in his. Calvin came on Thursdays, not as a pastoral duty, as the act of a man who had known Ruth Tanner and understood that honoring her meant making sure the person she had loved most was not left to carry the mornings alone. He brought no agenda and no sermon. He brought himself and sometimes soup, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table and talked about history and about Ruth, and about the specific and irreplaceable difficulty of learning to live in a house that used to hold 2 lives. The garden came back the following spring, not because Jean planned it, because Calvin brought seeds one Thursday in March and put them on the table without explaining why, and Jean looked at them for a moment and then went to the garage for the trowel that had been Ruth's. And Calvin held the seed packets while Jean knelt in the dirt that had gone to seed the summer before, and Birch lay in the sun at the edge of the garden beds and watched them work. Some things that have gone to seed come back if you give them the chance. Marcus came on Wednesdays, the way he came, not announced, not organized, just present. He and Jean walked Birch through the neighborhood that had been Jean's neighborhood for 39 years. And Jean named the trees the way a man names things he has lived with long enough to know them individually. And Birch walked between them, and was warm and unhurried, and entirely certain that walking between these two people on a Wednesday evening was exactly the assignment he had been given, and exactly the one he would have chosen. There are people in this world who say a goodbye and mean it, and then a warm weight sits on their feet and something shifts. Something that does not have a name, but has a direction, and the direction is back. Not back to the way things were. That is not available, and the story does not promise it. Back to the world, back to the Wednesday walks and the Thursday soup, and the Saturday calls with Daniel in the garden in spring, and the light that is on, now not as a performance and not as a pretense, but because a woman who knew her husband better than anyone has ever known him said, "It is for you now. Turn it on." He turns it on. Birch sleeps at the foot of Jean's bed on the nights Marcus leaves him there, which is most nights now, because a warm weight in a dark room is not nothing. It is for some people, in some seasons, the whole of what keeps the night from being too long to survive. It is not a small thing. It is not a small thing at all. This story is for every person who has been turning the light on alone and not telling anyone that it's different now. You are not performing fine for no reason. Someone in your life is waiting for you to call. They do not know how to go first. Ruth Tanner knew that about her husband and wrote it down so he would know it when he needed it. Someone knows it about you, too. If you are in a dark place right now, please tell someone. Your doctor, your pastor, a neighbor, a stranger in a parking lot if that's what's available. or text or call 988 any hour. The line is open. Someone will answer. You deserve someone who will answer. And for everyone who has ever sat down next to someone who said a goodbye to the air, you did the right thing. You stayed. That is the whole of what was needed. That is more than enough. If this story reached somewhere real for you, tell me in the comments. Not about the script, about you or someone you know. This section is for that. For the people who have been turning the light on alone. Let them know they are not invisible. If this channel is one you want to stay with, subscribe. These stories are for the ones who are still here, and the ones who helped them stay. There are more of them. You will want to be here for the next one. What will you carry from this one? I'll see you in the comments.